George is a pretty interesting fellow. He's got a long history. I came up with him this morning from Hamilton in the car. I wish I had a tape recorder going while I was driving, because it was just it was one great big history lesson. And so hopefully I'm proud of him to share a little bit more of that while he's up here. I was going to come up with a very large introduction for him, because he's got 75 years of flying, or actually more than that, probably close to 80 years worth of flying. He's 95 today. Well, it's not his birthday today, but he's 95 years old. And he walks without a walker, no cane, only uses his eyeglasses sparingly. He still drives and functions like a normal 35-year-old, okay? In some respects, George. Anyway, on Thursday at work, I was working away, and I could hear stuff going on in the hangar behind me, so I went out and looked, and they were pulling the T-bird out, the Mako Shark, and it had the canopy up, so I thought, oh, somebody's going flying today, and that's always exciting. I love watching that thing doing its backseat rides at Kitchener there. And so they pulled it out, and I thought, well, I'll go up to the front desk and ask who's going. So I went up to the front desk and said, who's going for the T-bird ride today? And they said, George Stewart. And so, of course, I wanted to see what was going on then, and I kept on making excuses to go out to the front to look out the front window. And I got to tell you, 95 years old, he went up the ladder of that there T-bird like he was a 20-year-old, okay? Maybe not quite as fast, but pretty near as fast. I've gotten into the back seat of that airplane, and it's a tight fit getting in, because the canopy comes at an angle, and you got to kind of wiggle your way in. Didn't bother George. So finally, I didn't have my camera. I had my iPad. I went out, and I got a picture of George. He's got the helmet on. He's a big smile on his face, and he was pumped. Boy, he was ready to go. And anyway, they fired up the jet, and he was with Ray Thwaites, and they taxied out. And as soon as the airplane started rolling, there's George in the backseat going like this, and then double thumbs up and fist pumping and the whole work. You'd think he was on his first airplane ride. Taxied out. They went for their flight and came back in. I missed them coming back in because I was busy. But I talked to Ray after, and I said, well, how was your flight with George? Did you get a word in edgewise? Because I know George likes to chat, And he said, I let George fly, and he said, he taught me how to roll a T-bird, okay? Ray's got quite a few hours in a T-bird now, but George hasn't flown a T-bird for decades. He taught Ray how to roll a T-bird. They went out and did 8 rolls out there, and George did 3 or 4 of them, okay, and he showed him, and he said, what he taught me, he said, I'm going to use when I roll the airplane from now on. So that's the kind of guy he is. Got a long history. We're going to prod you with the questions. George, come on up to the front here. George Stewart, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I just have to tell you something, that how incredibly important the Harvard was to me. I did the World War II thing, got paid to do it, $7 a day, went right up to $8.50 a day, even on Sunday, and got all that free flying. But I always longed to fly a heavy single. I got put on a twins probably because I graduated in projectile vomiting in my training. And but little did I know that I only had to look at the horizon. That would settle things down. So I don't get sick now either. But I must say that a Harvard was an airplane that I always hungered to fly. And little did I realize that after the war was finished, and 2 years later, they reactivated 424 Squadron flying Harvards. And I thought, that is just incredible.
George, you grew up in Hamilton.
Yes, I did.
How as a kid, did you come to join the Canadian Air Force?
Well, I remember I was 16, and I was trying to clear the ice off around our corner lot from just above Aberdeen near Locke Street and Undermount Avenue. And these big bombers were coming over from Mount Hope, and I said, you lucky devils, getting all that free flying, and here I am stuck down here, and the bloody war will probably end before I get a chance to get my free flying lessons. I was a great model aircraft enthusiast, and my heroes were Billy Bishop and Rick Tofen and all those great guys of World War I. And real airplanes had 2 wings. Now I see they misspelt the word lemon here, but the Yale was one that I was thankful that I didn't fly because it was a very dangerous airplane. And they changed to the Harvard, which was a miracle. And what the Harvard did for me is actually beyond belief. Even though I didn't fly it during the active part of the war, I flew it later, and subsequently it helped. Now, it just wasn't the aircraft. It was the people that flew them who showed me things, and things that I didn't. The other thing I should tell you about Louis Pasteur, the great scientist of the 1800s, he was sitting in his chair there. His wife came and said, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm thinking." He said, "Well, I wish you'd stop thinking and start doing something." He said, "My dear lady, in the field of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. Right now I'm thinking about milk." Now, Louis Pasteur is pretty famous. And how often does it happen that the best advice you get doesn't come out of a textbook, doesn't come out from a PhD? And I think of the semi that's going down the hill down towards Kenilworth Avenue in Hamilton, and going under the bridge, they had to stop and shift the load because it was a little too high. A 6-year-old kid said to his mother, "Why don't they let the air out of the tires?" "Shh, they'll hear you." Life is that simple very often, and just when you think that you know everything, you find out somehow somebody was looking in the right direction to notice what had to be done, and that's what they did. And I've had a lot of instances in the flying that I did that I ran across people who were able to give me that kind of help. And much as I loved flying, when I joined the Air Force, I had one airplane ride. That was for 20 minutes in a gypsy moth, given to me by my Uncle Cecil. And we used to ride our bicycles all the way down to the east end of Hamilton, take an hour to get there, and watch the airplane take off and land. But I was making model airplanes, so I knew I couldn't call it weight and balance and stuff, but I knew that it had to be along the center chord of the wing, and that part sticking way out was because it had to balance off the engine, which is sticking out front. So I knew the basics like that. So anyway, that's how it went on. And in 1942, I did get a chance to go to, in 1941, I tried to get in as an air gunner or something, just to get in, because I didn't have the education to be air crew. So I went up to the recruiting center, and the officer in charge said, "Well, I see that you wanted to become a pilot." I said, "Sir, the thing I want most in the whole world is to be a pilot of an airplane, but I don't have the education." This was Saturday. He says, "On Monday night at Delta Secondary School, we're offering a war emergency training plan class, 1 night a week for 20 weeks, to give people like yourself the math and science you needed at the level of which we needed for entry in the Air Force." I said, "Well, could I do that?" He says, "You're in it." So that's what I did, and my goodness, I studied. I think maybe 40 of us started, maybe 20 of us finished. But that allowed me to go in not just as anything I could be, ground crew or air gun or anything. It allowed me to go in any branch of the service. So that's how it happened. So in March of 42, I went into the Air Force, and then ITS, initial training, was at Gould Street in Toronto, which is just 1 block over from Jarvis Street, which was famous for other things. Don't laugh. My sister went to Jarvis Street in the WDs. So, first thing that happened, the nav instructor, after I finished, we had outside the supermarket, you see these little link trainers that you can sit in. That's the only flying I had done. But I went to ITS and wait a second, I didn't go to ITS at that point. I went to Manning Pool. And then I went to ITS initial training. And after the course was finished, the nav instructor came along and said, we're going to send you to nav school. I said, but sir, I wanted to become a pilot. He said, well, your link trainer marks were not very good. I said, but the link trainer instructor told me that I had very good coordination. He said, well, I'll check back. He came back 10 minutes later. You're going to Goderich. We had your name mixed up with somebody else's. So that's how I got to go to Goderich on the Tiger Moth. In those days, real airplanes had two wings, one above the other. And that's all I knew, but I knew about the others that were flying, and everybody wanted to become a Spitfire pilot and date all those beautiful girls who love the guys with their top button undone, the fighter pilots. And but I was so keen to fly, and to get a chance to do it was happiness beyond belief. So I went off to Goderich, and one of the most important flights I ever made was a solo cross-country to Kitchener. Land, shut down, go in. I bought a Coke and an O. Henry bar. Nothing gets better than that. Then I went out to the airplane. They had to hand prop it, and flew back to Goderich. And then I finished that, and then I went to Centralia, probably because in the Goderich training, I found out that I had motion sickness, and of course, that wouldn't do too much for fighter pilots. But I wanted to be a fighter pilot, but at least I have a chance to be a pilot. So that's what happened. I went to Centralia, but I did have a mid-air collision. So that was kind of exciting. And when you're in the Air Force, one of the things you dread the most is the visiting flight from Trenton. They come to test the instructors for their category rides and any problems. And after I had the mid-air collision, they asked me to go out for a ride. And I got in there, hey, take me over to where that accident was. So that's what I did, and I showed them where it was, and we came back. So we went through with that, and I carried on and graduated, and then I went overseas. And when I was at Bournemouth, of course, everybody's coming out from the interview, heavy bombers by night, heavy bombers by night, heavy bombers by... So I expect heavy bombers by night. So I got in there, and he said, well, Stewart, what would you like? He said, you can't have Spitfires. We got enough pilots for that. I said, I don't care about Spitfires. I said, sir, the airplane that I hunger to fly more than any other airplane in the whole world is the de Havilland Mosquito. He says, well, I can't send you there directly, but I will send you to a night fighter AFU on Blenheims. And if you're successful there, you'll go to the Mosquito or the Beaufighter. He said, well, could I get that? He says, you're in it. So I went to Grantham, and at Grantham, everybody wanted to fly the Mosquitoes. But we flew the short-nosed Blenheim, the one with the Blenheim Mark 1, not the Bolingbroke with the nose that sticks out, but the short nose. And there was a privy down at the flight line with a shovel beside the door. And a little note beside it said, hierarchical hopes, dig here. The Mosquito OTO at hierarchical. So as it happened, it worked for me, and I got posted to hierarchical and flying the Mosquito. I still hungered to fly things like the Spitfires and the Harvards and stuff like that, heavy singles, but never had a chance. So I went through the war flying the twins, and did some ferrying with it too, and came back, and the war ended, and I thought, well, that's the end of things. What the heck am I going to do now? So I went to Ann Foster's music shop and said, look like the war is over. I don't know what the heck I'm going to do now. I'd like some piano music, something real simple like Chopin. He says, are you out of your mind? That's as hard as it is to get. I said, okay, just give me the prelude. So that was going to be the end of the flying for me, I thought. So that went on for a couple of years. I went back working at the engraving business and running.
Hold on, George. Hold on.
Woo.
You missed all the war years.
Oh, yeah, that. Yeah. I got paid to do that. Actually, the war years, for me, became another turning point. I was just going to say you misspelled the word lemon down here. This Yale. It's not lemon, it's lemon. The one airplane I dreaded to fly was the Yale, and it didn't come out of a spin very well, so fortunately I didn't do that. But after finishing training and going overseas and flying at hierarchical to fly the Mosquito, that was really something. And I remember going out for the first time carrying my parachute and my headset, helmet, and looking at this thing, gorgeous, enormous, 11-ton Mosquito. And I hit the side. It's like hitting a cement abutment. It was that solid. I thought, my God, how will this ever get off the ground? But as soon as those engines started up, it's just like a racehorse wanting to go. And taxiing out, it was not a difficult airplane to stick handle, but it had some nasty little tricks. They had two engines, 1,650 horsepower, 16 feet apart, swinging 12-foot propellers. And the airplane weighed up to, we flew up to 11 tons. And I was 19, and I'm going to fly this thing. I thought, good God, what am I doing here? But we took off, and we did a steep turn. Just a gentle turn, you're almost 90 degrees because you're cruising at 240 miles an hour, which is way beyond what I ever expected. So then he pulled it a little tighter. You could see the wingtip vortices coming off the wingtips from the condensation. And then we came back to land, and you had to be very careful taking off and landing. They said, because both engines props turn the same way, you've got torque to continue or to consider. So they suggested that we lead with the left throttle to counteract the torque. And then there were brakes like this. So, and then as you release the brakes and lead with the left throttle to keep straight, the tail will come up at 70 miles an hour approximately. And then you'll be able to steer. I thought, well, my God, how are you going to steer until you get there? But you could have, if you had to, little taps of brakes, but you didn't want to use brakes because that would slow you down. But once the tail came in the air, you had good rudder control. And then, at 125 miles an hour, you lift off. You just to stop the wheels, and you hold the gear up, and you hold it down to 50 to 100 feet until you've got about 170 miles an hour, which is your single engine safety speed. If you go to climb out and you lose one engine below that speed, bang, you are dead as fast as that. Flips you right on your back because of the whew. So we didn't like that part of it. But I made sure that I held the speed down till I had about 180 before I started to climb out, because at that speed on one engine you could hold it level. Reg Spence at the Flying Club was flying one out of London one time and had an engine failure on takeoff. And he actually got down on the river, but flew below till he got enough speed to get up, and he got away with it. And the Chinese, after the war, bought 200 Mosquitoes, and they were very keen to fly them. They got them for...
Oh, you're getting distracted again, George. Go back to England.
Oh, I'm back in England. Okay. Going to fly the Blenheim. I'm on the Mosquito.
Yeah, you're flying the Mosquito. Now, tell us about you did 50 sorties at night.
Oh,
Actually,
yes.
before we
Okay.
get there, let's go to the Mediterranean.
Okay, well, after we finished operational training in the Mosquitoes, Squadron Leader Russell, who was a CFI, said, we've had an urgent request from the Middle East from a squadron down there who needs new pilots and Mosquitoes to make up their losses. So a whole bunch, about 5 or 6 of us put our hands up, and I thought, get more Mosquito time that way. So we went down to Lynham and then to Filton to pick up an airplane, brought it back to Lynham. Then we did a consumption test. Normally it cruises at 240 miles or 260 miles an hour, but you had to fly just enough to keep flying about 210 miles an hour with the RPMs pulled back. So lower the revs and boost the boost. More petrol, home to roost. So we got up to 2.71 air miles per gallon. And that was pretty darn good. And we found that on the consumption test. Now we had another device under the seat, which was a pilot relief tube. Now I don't know if anybody has ever heard of those, but I sort of needed one of those just a few minutes ago. But you could pull them out from under the seat, and if you had to use the bathroom, you could do it in this little cup. It had an airlock, and I tried it on the thing, and it blew it back on me, so I didn't bother with that. But what we did when we first went to go flying in that airplane, we went out to the tail wheel and we christened it. And because we're going to be up maybe 5 hours or more, and there's no going back to go to the John. But I know that's exciting for you to hear, but that's all part and parcel of the heroic job that those guys did. But the night intruder activity was very interesting because the German Focke-Wulf 190s and Ju-88s would attack our bomber stream, which was going after a main target. And they would expend all their ammo and come back to their home base to get more fuel and ammunition. We were waiting for them, circling their airfield at 500 to 5,000 feet, just waiting for them for an hour and letting them know we're there. They were so afraid of us that if they shot us down, it would count double. That made us feel really good. But the other thing we found was that we had to develop night vision training. So we had my visual night vision was a score of 22, which was very good. So, but in daylight, when you're looking at something, you're focusing with the center of vision and everything is sharp. At night, that is permanently gone. So you have to look through the periphery this way when you're looking for something, and you can see black on black, believe it or not. And that happened more than once. One time I was at Ardorf Marx in Varel, and I was circling around backwards around the circuit, and Paul said, "Hey, there's a guy downwind." So I raced around and tore after him and got a few squirts at him on final, all around the cockpit with 4 cannons and 4 machine guns. And it went right across the level at 0 feet, and it pulled up back into the circuit. And I saw this black thing going this way. thought, my God. So I went up and I did a wing over and came back, and I got a squirt at him, a Heinkel 111, black on black. But the thing that protects your night vision, besides the way they lit our instruments with ultraviolet, was red. Red is the key. So for an hour before we go night flying, whether it's operational or not, we wore red goggles. And when we went out, we took the red goggles with us. And just when you're going to get in the airplane, the ground crew would shine the flashlight in your face and say, I wish you wouldn't do that. But anyway, that's how we handled it. And but in the daytime, we did a night flying test for a half hour or whatever. I always did 45 minutes minimum because it was all free and I got more fun. Did low flying and everything. Had a wonderful time. But we left the parachute all set with everything all set, the parachute in the place and the seatbelts ready to put on in the dark. And then the gun sight, graticule, was red. So that meant it didn't affect our night vision. So we were able to use that and fire this way, when we're shooting at something. We didn't really get much opportunity to shoot at airplanes too much because they're pretty skittish. They'd come back after hitting our bombers and find that we're in the circuit. They'd try to go somewhere else and maybe not make it. So we put more fear into them that way than actually shooting them down. We damaged about 4 airplanes. But not for recreation, but for other things to do, we used to shoot up trains. Always make sure we didn't see a line of light making it a passenger train, but the freight trains, and we shot at the engine. And I remember shooting at one engine and it just, and it stopped almost immediately. So we did about 15 trains. And but the flying was so interesting because you never knew where you were going to end up. As I mentioned when we went, did I mention that going down to the Mediterranean one time, we lost 11 out of 30 airplanes with bad weather, just delivering them. 11 out of 30. That's terrible. And a lot of our stuff was cat's eye and visual. We didn't have AI, radar in the airplane because we didn't want the enemy to get it if we were shot down. So one time we were at Schleswig-Holstein, a place that was called Biblis, and we were looking for trains and stuff. And every once in a while we'd come over this darn place and they'd be at us with their ruddy old searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. So I got a bit of road rage and I stuck the nose down and I gave it to them with cannons and machine guns and pulled up and something went, I thought, oh God. The starboard engine started to run rough and I quickly feathered the propeller and climbed up and away and around and obviously they had hit the radiator or something, so I feathered that propeller. Now we had to come, 400 miles across the North Sea on one engine, and you say, what about the other radiator, on the other side? So I got closer to the German north coast that I would really want to be, but I wanted to be able to get hopefully to Holland before we would jump out if we had to. But as it happened, we got back and the CO said, take it to Woodbridge. I said, I can't. I don't think I've got enough fuel to get there or something. Woodbridge was an emergency landing field. But I came, it was the starboard engine that was feathered, and I touched down and I went around this way, around the perimeter track, right into my parking place on one bloody engine. George, the ground crew, came up and said, well, you guys have had quite a time, haven't you? I said, yeah. We got out of there, please. He said, come here, I want to show you something. So he took us around to the starboard radiator and said, see that little thing there? That's a hole. Yeah, that went through the radiator. You lost all your antifreeze. So he said, no, he took my hand and said, why don't you come on here with me? He took me to the other side and looked at the other radiator. It's about that big, not about that wide. And it had a rad flap below it. There was a glance off the aluminum skin underneath there, that far from going through there. So I would have had another bullet and I would have been swimming today. So we got home. But those things didn't happen all the time, and you certainly didn't look for them, but you had to handle things as they came. And that set me up for so much, you know, and it even helped me get to be able to fly the Harvard after the war, which was wonderful.
Distracted again. Yeah, the Harvard keeps on distracting you, George. Tell us about your instant feel.
Oh, that's it. When they started up 424 Squadron, as an auxiliary squadron in Hamilton, they were flying Harvards. And I thought, oh, God, can heaven be so great? I think they gave me an hour and a half checkout and sent me solo. I thought, 2 years after the war had stopped. But anyway, we got to fly the Harvards, and Bob Smith was a Spitfire pilot. Previously had been a fantastic Harvard instructor. And Bob Smith and Bill Olmsted, who was another highly decorated Spitfire pilot, in the desert. I met him at Algiers, at Fort Delot, and he was sitting up in the top bunk, blowing his head off with pneumonia and feeling terrible. And he had taken my sister out on a date. He lived in Hamilton. So that was fine. So Bill Olmsted went back to England, and he flew Spitfires. He went to the fighter school, and then he had DSO and DFC and all those big things. And he came home. He lived through all of that, but then he was going to the doctor and somehow went off the road and into a tree and was killed. And a guy who had just been through the war, but Bill Olmsted, Bob Smith was the other one. Bob Smith, a lot of those guys flew in France, you know, and they came away, they didn't get all the gongs and stuff because the people that would recommend them were getting shot down too. But he was a great Spitfire pilot. He was also a fantastic Harvard instructor. Bob Smith was the one who showed me best how to handle the Harvard. The first big tip was setting up your rudder pedals. It doesn't seem like much, set your rudder pedals up. But to me, it was so important. You sit in the back of the seat and you set the rudder pedals so that with the heels up, you can go full rudder with either rudder without applying any brake. So that meant that you had full control. If you were swinging with that, brakes are optional. But that alone was enough to keep us safe instead of grabbing brakes and reacting the wrong way. So that made a heck of a difference to us. It was just an amazing experience. And he also showed us that if you're being attacked by an enemy airplane, you just go into a nice gentle turn, and just as he's getting in range, you go like this. There's no way he could come around and get you. So those are the things that he showed us, and it was so helpful. And Dick Pattison was another. He was a two-tour Mosquito Pathfinder pilot, and he taught me about the smooth control. Instead of going like this, you have just a, entry like that with a limp wrist. And that evened off the way you would apply controls, and you could work it that way too. So that smoothed out the flying very much. So that when I went to China, am I at China yet?
George.
Yeah. After the war, the Chinese bought some mosquitoes, 200 of them. They sent a dozen guys over to Downsview to check out, and they're going to go home and check out their guys. So they crashed about 8 or 9 airplanes. So Moose Fumerton, Canada's top scoring night fighter ace, was one of the instructors, and Dick Pattison was the two-tour Mosquito Pathfinder pilot. They were checking these guys out, but it wasn't working out. It was in the wintertime, and the snowbanks were crowding the runway, so they put more in the runway than they had. So Moose Fumerton said to the Chinese, this isn't working out too well. How would you like it if we came over to China and helped you with your training? Oh, would you do that? Yes, we would. So I was at Robert's restaurant one night, and Saturday night, and I was called to the telephone. Oh, George, it's Dick Pattison. How would you like to fly the Mosquito again? I said, was that you over Hamilton today? I wondered if you had seen me. So that's how it all started. So, but I had no pilot's license, no instructor's rating, no instrument rating, but I was fresh from the war. And I had started flying the Harvard. So that put me in a great position to go and teach the Chinese how to fly. I wouldn't say most, but many, 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 many of the Chinese pilots, well, they hated the Mosquito. They called it Lin Dai Yu, after an ancient empress who was beautiful but wicked. Of the 50 they got put together, no, of the 150 they bought, they crashed 50. So then we went over and stopped that. So, you know, when you do your HTMPFGS before takeoff, does anybody know those letters? HTMPFGS? That's the vital action test before takeoff. Well, the Chinese, a lot of them didn't speak English, so we would draw the circuit like that and sit down with them. Well, the British came up in their system with World War II of a vital action checks before takeoff, like HTMPFGS, hydraulics, trim, pitch, and so forth, and the different checks on takeoff, after takeoff, downwind, and final and stuff, so that you cover all the bases. Now, a vital action check is vital, because if you miss something on a vital action check before you take off, and you end up with the engine stopping because you didn't check the fuel or the selection, and oh, he's coming in, yeah. Well, it could be bad news. So what we did was we broke it down because they were terrified of the aircraft. We tried to make it like it's a great RV. So what I used to do is I'd say, now look at this airplane is big, and you know, it's mighty, but there are a few things that you have to know so it will obey you. It only reacts to the control of the pilot or the lack of control. So you have to make it do your bidding. So instead of HTMPFGS, I broke it down into brakes, bomb doors, trim, tit, tighten, mixer, mod, pitch pump, fuel flaps, gills, gyros, switches, which seems like kind of a mouthful, but brakes and bomb doors were hydraulics. Brakes, bomb, trim, elevator, rudder, and aileron. Tit, de-icing, tit neutral. Tighten the throttle quadrant. Mixture is automatic, but you always say mixture. Moderate, superchargers moderate. Pitch, propellers full forward. Pumps, booster pumps on. Gills, radiator flaps. Gyros on the runway heading and settle your horizon. Switches, the mag switches and generator switches and everything. And I had an occasion in China where our chief engineer at Hankow went to Shanghai for some reason or other. Techno was coming back, and they're over the 3,800-foot mountain, and they were getting ignition cuts. So they did an emergency landing on an abandoned grass aerodrome, which had like a grass runway area, and right through the center of it, across it, was a stream. And glass up to your behind, I'll say, in the field. So they managed to get it down there and land and end up on a knoll at the far end of the runway. They sent me down to fetch it. So we flew down in 3 little airplanes with the engineers and so forth. And Moose Farmerman said, "I want you to bring it back." I said, "Oh, okay, well, I'll go and have a look at it." I had to find out how it would run up. Now, what had happened was they got ignition cuts from it sitting in the hot, hot sun. And at 8,000 feet or 9,000 feet, the fuel vaporized in the lines and they lost fuel pressure. All he had to do was turn on the booster pumps. And he's a bloody engineer. So, let me tell you, did I ever run that airplane up? But first I took off in the little airplane, and I took off and flew around to see where the heck we are. It had a fence and stumps of air raid shelters and stuff, and grass up to your you-know-what. And so I aimed out towards the runway. I was getting in and strapping in. The 2 engineers got in. I said, "Where the heck do you think you're going?" He says, "We're not going back with them, we're coming back with you." I said, "We may not get over that last fence over there. You're taking your life in your hands." He said, "We don't care, we're going back with you." Another 350 pounds I didn't need. But on over 1,100 hours in the airplane, I say 1,100 hours, I had more than that, because the Chinese weren't satisfied with the way we were doing it. They wanted us to send them solo after an hour, whether they're ready or not. They crashed 8 or 9 trying to do it themselves in Shanghai. Then finally they said, "We're okay." But he said, "Send them solo after an hour, whether they're ready or not." We're taking one guy up to 16 hours to go solo. But it was a runway where there was a dike wall, a 20-foot dike wall around it. The infield was so rough it could wreck the airfield. Then you go over a little boulevard to go into the line of parked aircraft. So they were physical as well as mental hazards. So we developed a special way to handle it, and it was a zero boost policy. I'd been in Shanghai and talking to Dick Pattison and picking up another airplane. Freddie Offer, the other instructor, the other test pilot, taxied into the Mosquito, and he's out where the Harvard is there, and stopped and aimed towards us. Up came the power, up came the tail, and he's standing still. I said, "My God. If he's got enough prop wash to lift the tail up like that with the elevators, then there's enough going past the fat part of the rudder to steer, because the run engines were 16 feet apart. So that's why I thought we'd have no rudder control. But the fat part of the rudder in the aircraft was down closer to near the elevators. So, and it worked out that way. So I said, "Freddie, what did you have on that to lift it?" He said, "Zero boost, like 30 inches of manifold pressure." I said, "My God." So instead of starting off with 0, there are brakes like that, like the old streetcar, so I braked it like that, pull it back in my gut, then put it up to 0 boost, and then simultaneously, as I let the brakes go, push the stick forward and the throttle to the gate, I'd go full right rudder to stop the left turn, and it was that simple. So that's how it worked out. And Of course, that gave a lot of confidence to the boys that did it. I was up one time, and this aircraft went whipping across. And I thought, my God, he's pretty... Oh, and then I'd take him up, I'd show him the instant feel exercise. Then I'd show him a couple of rolls and stuff like that. And when I was at Greenwood, I should mention this, we had a very timid guy converting to the Mosquito, George Seymour. And I said, George, you've got to get your head out of the bloody cockpit at night. You got to see where you're going and what's going on. I said, let's go and have a little fun. So I told the tower would be leaving the circuit for a while, went up over the Bay of Fundy and around, and I got up to 8,000 or 9,000 feet. I said, okay, now we just follow through, and we did the sweep turns, and I said I went up and I did a roll, and I let him do a roll. Then I did a loop. I never had looped the Mosquito, but I did it at night, as black as you can be. Well, let me tell you, George Seymour went back, and he was a tiger. Did he ever go? So that's one time when something extreme like that really sells. But it was a beautiful aircraft. But, you know, when you're like that, it doesn't matter what you do with the controls. There's no lift involved. So you just wait, you go full deflection something, and it just goes down and weathercocks down into a line of recovery, and then you push the ball to the center and pull it out of the dive. But you can fly these airplanes almost below not the stalling speed, but below the single engine safety speed and stuff. And if you go to climb out, over you go. So we would show them what happens when that does it. So it made me much more helpful to the Chinese boys than it would have been, and then this Hubert Sung, he was kind of a favorite to Madame Chiang Kai-shek. He went terrassing across the field, and I landed. He came running over to me. He said, Mr. Stewart, have a soda. I just went solo. That Hubert, God bless you, that's wonderful. And from that day on, they called it solo water. So anyway, that was the Chinese affair, but it put me in a very good position. But I did mention going there without a map.
Tell us how you got out of China, because it was the communists were coming.
Oh yes. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong were having a nasty little battle. The war that ended in 46-49 war. And our guys flew off to Formosa, which is now Taiwan, with the Mosquitoes they could take with them. We got out by train to Hong Kong, or to, Hong Kong. Went through Canton, then to Hong Kong, hoping to goodness we wouldn't be caught. And then we got on an airliner, Chinese nationalist airliner, landed back in Shanghai. The communists were about 5 miles out of town. We landed there for gas. I thought, my goodness, this is pretty scary. But that worked, and we got out. Ichi Tong, who was my first pupil, tried to fly back to see if he could get his grandparents out at Nanking, just north of Nanking. He landed there and went up country. He couldn't get them to move, so he had to leave them. He came back, there were a bunch of mosquitoes sitting around, gold bars all over the place, people trying to get out. And he found one that got it started up, and he was the last guy out of China. So Marion and I went over there as their guest of the Republic of China Air Force a few years ago. And they put us up in a hostel. Marion says, I don't want to go to some hostel where the bathroom's a block and a half down the hall. They said, Marion, they wouldn't do that to us. So it happened that the Republic of China Air Force had a 5-star hotel in Taipei, and we were in the general's suite on the 9th floor. So there's a nice big bouquet from the head of the Air Force. So next morning, we're going to go down and meet them, and General Leong came and picked me up and got off the floor. I want you to meet an old friend. I said, oh, I want to, this ramrod straight little guy like this, just like that. I said, my God, Colonel Chen. I gave him a great big eye. I said, God, it's good to see you again. He was head of the Air Force for a while, but he was blind but ramrod straight. But I checked him out in aerobatics in 1948. Isn't that something? Then after they had this sit down before dinner, the dinner had a table about the size of that whole circle of people there. And the head of the Air Force was there. They treated us royally, took us all over the place in Hong Kong. And then Marion was very delighted. They assigned a fighter pilot to be her guide. And she'd go down, oh, you don't go down there. The lady's sitting there with her feet going like this, you know. That's a bad part of town. But we had our wonderful, General Leong, or General Chen, who became the head of the Air Force, got up and said, I want to say something. He said, I want to tell you what these gentlemen did for us in China in 1948. And everybody's very quiet. So he went and told us how we had sort of saved the day for them. And I met another very famous person. Have you ever heard of Dr. Robert McClure? A very famous missionary. We rubbed shoulders with him at Hankow. And he was a great, and Dalziel was another. So we got along with the missionaries too, although sometimes we weren't too religious. But he was telling me one time they had the Hate the Foreigners parade. They're marching up, hate the foreigner, kill the foreigner, hate the foreigner, kill the foreigner. And that night, a guy came to the fence, the wall, and said, Dr. McClure, Dr. McClure. I said, yes, you must come. My wife needs you badly. She's terribly ill. So he went to this guy's house and must have saved his wife's life. And then next day he's leading the parade again. Hate the foreigner, hate the foreigner, hate the foreigner. So, but he was on the Burma Road, terrible conditions, and he took off his jacket and gave it to some poor freezing coolie who was just about freezing to death. So you never can tell with a medical missionary what the heck they're actually doing when they get in the field. He says, the way you do it, you spit on the floor, you do everything, you get closer to them. You just act like they do, then they trust you. And but the guys that we were flying with were like the cream of the crop. And it was just, but we were told, don't bother trying to drive here, because if you do, they'll get you, and you have to keep them for the rest of your life if you have an accident. So we got out by train and so forth, but going to Taiwan like that was just something. So did I mention that the head of the Air Force then took his wings off and gave them to me, the head of the Republic of China Air Force. So that was a wonderful time. So most of my time in flying has been with my mouth since then, because people are interested in the Mosquito particularly. But if they really knew what effect was brought about by being introduced to the Harvard, they'll realize that everything I did since then was a factor of having been shown the instant field exercise and all of those things. And for example, Gary McCann from London bought a Mustang from a guy in Mississippi, a farmer. And he asked me to go down and fetch it. Well, I did fly the Mustangs, but it was 18 years before that. And I went down there, and sure, it's all ready to go. And Gary got in the back seat, and as I say, I only went full throttle on the Mosquito twice. But this was the Mustang. So I was a little, not just curious, I was a little wondering how this was going to be, but he taxied it out, and we got in, and it was a two-seater, one with a seat in the back. And we got it, landed at Cincinnati. I can't tell you what the dirty registration, but it was changed to FUZ when we got home. So I'm the only one that flew with the bad word. But anyway, life is like that, and we get through the best way we can, but with the help of our friends. So the best information we can get is not always from a textbook. It's for somebody who sees something like past your fate.
It's about your days at the CWH, the Canadian Warplane Heritage.
Yeah, Canadian Warplane Heritage was another chapter. I'm always stopping flying, except yesterday. And Alan Ness was flying the Firefly, and I went up with him in a Harvard or something. Dennis Bradley asked me if I would. Colin Campbell, who was a fantastic instructor with the Flying Club, but none of the male members of his family lived beyond 50. He was at the YMCA, I think, on his 50th birthday and dropped dead. And Dennis said, with Colin gone like that, I wondered if you would come into the foundation, Warplane Heritage, and fly with the sponsors in the airplane that they're sponsoring until you think they're ready to go. Check them out in the Harvard or the Chipmunk or whatever, or Tiger Moth, and then fly that airplane till they're ready. So I did get to fly quite a few of the airplanes. I have a list in here. So without dual, the Mosquito, after 3 years, the Mustang, after 18 years, the Firefly, the Spitfire. The Spitfire is the one that Don Plum had in London, CF-RAF. He had a Mustang, CF-USA, which he unfortunately was killed in at midair. The TBM Grumman Avenger, the B-25, the B-17. Now, how the heck do you go and fly those things full of passengers? And the Beech 18, Austin Wadsworth in Geneseo. He says, I want to see that instant field exercise. We'd been going down there doing air shows. So I said, Austin, it's pretty simple. So we went up in the Beech 18. I've never sat in one of those. It's one of the earlier airlines, I guess. And we went up, and briefly, the instant field exercise is like this. You get up to 8,000 feet or whatever the heck you want to do, and you cage all the gyros, and then you trim it so that it's hands off. Then you do very, very steep turns to the left, holding height exactly, pushing the ball to the center. You can feel whether you're shifting this way to know how far to push, because you can't just read instruments. Then you come around this way. Every time it's a different amount of rudder to push the ball to the center. And coming back, you just check your altitude as you're coming back this way, keeping the ball in the center. And gradually losing speed till at some time it gets to the point where the inside wing will snatch. Well, that means you've come down from the circuit speed or cruise down to approach speed. So that gives you the feel of the aircraft. Now, you can imagine the difference it makes if you have the feel of the aircraft from cruise to approach. Like driving, if you're going to drive a Ferrari worth $500,000, you don't go up to the highway speed right away, but you take it really gently and you do everything you can to make it, you comfort it, and you fly it with a passion in the flying, because that gives you, it's telling the airplane that you love it, and it had better love you back or you're going to wreck it. But it works so many ways in so many airplanes. And even in the simulator, I flew their IDF, the Indigenous Defense Fighter, and all those things in simulators. So the same thing works. So, but in flying the Harvard particularly, because it's got all the dirty little tricks built in that the Mustangs and the Hurricanes and Spitfires would display if they're treated badly, so forth. But what it has is, it's got the response by confident, positive control, intelligently applied. And with the numbers of airplanes that I flew, really without any training, the stage was set for me by the Harvard. I did fly the Mosquitoes and stuff, and it worked out very well for me. And to fly them and use the instant feel exercise for the boys in China, that was a great help. And it made such a difference. It all started off with the Harvard. Now, I mentioned about the Yale. I didn't want to fly the Yale. That was a hard airplane to fly. That was an airplane that resisted coming out of a spin. And they stopped using it and used the Harvards. But it's a marvelous museum piece. But they look like a Harvard, but they're not.
Getting tired yet, George?
Pardon?
You getting tired yet?
No, not yet.
Okay, well then tell us about your
still
trip to
dry.
England
Huh?
in 1988.
Oh, 1988. Kermit Weeks, a rich young man in Florida, was 28 years old, and he went to England and bought the last flying Mosquito in the world, Mosquito bomber. And he called up Warplane Heritage, said, is there anybody up there who would be able to go over to England and help fly back a Mosquito? The guy who was the engineer apparently had a heart attack, but Rick Frank said, have I got a guy for you? So I had a lot of time in the airplane, but it was quite a long time ago. But your body never really forgets that. Like if you get in the car and you're comfortable in it, and you have to look way ahead so you can see if, as, and when you're going to pass, it's just like that. And there's no magic about it, but in so many ways it's sensational. So I went over to England by airline and told the crew that I was going over for that, and they said, oh, are you lucky, and so forth, so forth. And then I went down to where the airplane was sitting, and George Aird, who had flown Mosquitoes as a test pilot, flew it down from Scotland down to, I think it was Lynham, I just forget. In any case, we flew it down from, what's that place where they do the Olympics, just west, near Wimbledon. We went past Wimbledon to where the airplane was. And I thought we'd have a little time, to spend before doing it, but no, it had to go right away. So we took off, and we headed, I said, would you go over Little Snoring, where I flew the Mosquitoes during the war? So we did that, and met the only other flying Mosquito in the world. And we formated with him. And then we went to Scotland. And then that was very interesting. Then I thought, now, we're going to go across the Atlantic. Well, there's a westerly wind from there usually. That'll take us longer, I think. But anyway, we had a good dinner the night before and got up early and got into the airplane, and we headed off for Iceland. And just going over there, I don't know what I had eaten, but it wasn't very good. And he says, how are you doing? I said, what do you mean? He said, anatomically. I said, I've seen better days. I said, I'll hurry. we got to we got to Iceland, Reykjavik, and that was something. I remember getting out of the airplane and dropping a chalk on my toe and running up the hill to the John, so that the crisis was over. But we stayed overnight there, and there was ice and snow, and 10,000 feet. We looked down. Oh, this is Reykjavik. Then we took off from Reykjavik, and then we went to Greenland, to Narsarsuaq. And going there, you know, you're at 10,000 feet going over there and looking down, and this little thing looks like a runway. That's where we're going to land. Not only that, they used to, in the ferry days, they'd go up like this, up the fjord, and land that way, and take off and come back this way, because you couldn't take off the way you're going, because you're going into the mountain. So I said, that's going to be nice. George Stewart had flown 45 airplanes over the Atlantic, so I felt very good about that. But I thought, you know, this is, if you ever lost an engine, you know, that would be quite a time. So we got there, and lots of other people there. A guy and his wife were there. She was the pilot of this airplane, the twin-engine airplane they were flying over from overseas. And so we did run it up very well, and got ready to go, and took off, and he went down and climbed and made all the right turns and got up to 10,000 feet, and to Reykjavik. No, this is Reykjavik. We went to Narsarsuaq, up the fjord, and looked down and landed in there towards the mountain, then took off this way and headed for Goose Bay. And I wasn't really supposed to change seats with him, because Kermit didn't want me doing that. But I'll tell you now that we did I flew it from the west coast of Greenland for an hour and a half, and then we changed seats, and he went back and landed at Goose Bay. But it was an exciting trip to do that, and it was the last Flying Mosquito bomber flying in the world, so it was quite a thing. And George Stewart was a fantastic pilot, and he had a lot of experience. Very modest guy. Then we went to Quebec City and Hamilton and got there. So that was great.
George, we're gonna end it up now. I want you to tell the story. You called yourself a wartime virgin, and I thought that was interesting, because you said that's one of the reasons why you survived the war.
I don't mean to tell you ladies this, but one of the things that when you're growing up and you're a teenager like I am, you have this terrible thing called passion. And sadly, when you're in the service, you look cuter. So the girls thought you were adorable. And I thought, well, my real job, I was a delivery boy on a bike making $5 a week and paying $4 board. So what the heck kind of father and husband would I be? So, and what if I get myself killed and so forth? Or even worse, what if I fall in love over there and get married, and then I bring my wife and child home, and I go back to my real job, was a $5 a week delivery boy on a bike, and it's paid $4 board. So sadly, I went through the whole war without having really experienced that fantastic feeling. But I just had this ridiculous conscience that I couldn't do that to a family. But lots of guys did, and they died. You know, and there's so many young families left with facing the world alone. Yeah. So anyway.
One final thing, how did you win your DFC?
It came with a lunch. No, I think what happened was, the thing is, Bob Smith and those people should have had those things too. Bill Olmsted didn't when he was in the Middle East, but he came and went to the fighter school, then flew over Germany. He had a DSO and DFC and stuff. But they said that I did a lot of trips, you know, and damaged aircraft in the air and on the ground, and many trains, and he said I was a good sport doing it. Something like that, but they were very nice.
Thank you very much, George.
Thank
We're
you.
so glad you're here. I'm going to open the floor now to questions. I see Bjarne with his finger up. Okay, Bjarne wants to know how to roll the T-33.
Oh yeah, that's an airplane. I had never flown a jet airplane.
Speak in the mic there, okay?
Oh yeah,
See a
sure.
black ball in front of you there?
Hello there. Is that better? Something I always wanted to do was fly a jet airplane. We got the T-33. You know what they look like? It was an airplane that, when we got the Mustangs, Toronto got the T-33s. I don't have it here. And I always wanted to fly a jet. I had just under 20 hours on the type. But the thing I learned with Harvard was that Bob Smith said, if you're going straight up or straight down, there is no lift involved. So instead of when you get on your side and kicking bottom rudder and up like in this and this, you take something like a dart, which doesn't have any lifting surfaces, does a perfect trajectory all the way to a target, doing a perfect roll. So I said, if I do that, like the Mosquito is going straight up or straight down is just like anything else. And same with the Harvard. But I was at was at Greenwood, I guess I did the Jesus. Anyway, I was at the CWH. No, what the heck was it? The 424 Squadron, yeah, after the war. So I messed around with that. I thought, so if I go straight up or straight down, Bob Smith said, it's just like doing a dart. So I had been taking a bit of engineering, and in engineering talk, a curve is a locus of a point that moves according to a given law. In other words, a curve is a path taken by a point that moves according to a given law. So if you fly a trajectory, a parabola is a curve where every line from the center of focus to the curve radiates in a parallel line. And I said, holy smoke, that's gravity. So that means if I could go weightless, I can just keep rolling like a dart, and I don't have to muck around like this with all that stuff. And I really taught myself aerobatics on the Mosquito doing that, but refined it on the Harvard. And when we were at, where were we? Yeah, flying the T-33, that gave me a real opportunity because of the speed. I was able to dive down, and I pulled up, and I did a continuous consecutive roll, I think 5 or something times without stopping, just like that. So I went up in one just the other day at Wellington Waterloo, and he did a roll, and then I did a roll. I didn't do any of the others because it's a pretty expensive time, but I did 3 rolls, and he thought they were pretty good, but and I haven't flown one of those for 50 years.
Just doing that parabolic arch in a T-38 go 13 rolls in a time.
15?
13, 1-3.
Oh boy, yeah.
The guy was trying to make us sick but didn't succeed.
Well, you know something, if you've got the speed, say you're supersonic and you pull up, you can just keep going until, it'll follow a trajectory as you just sit barely sitting in your seat. And a lot of those things are fuel injected instead of gravity. So, but the Harvard is gravity fed, and so is the Mosquito. So,
In your experience with the Mossy, when the first time you climbed board, put your chute on the seat, buckled in, did you ever think of how the hell am I going to get out of this thing if I have to bail out?
yeah.
Because that door is awful bloody small.
Well, it's smaller than you think, and it's only half the size when you really need it. But the floor, the bomber one had a floor at the bottom, but we had a door at the side, and it's about this big, and you get up past the navigator's knees and sit in your seat, so we'd have to dive out that way. So we did bailout drill by going onto a bladder, bailing out. I think I got out in 15 seconds or something like that. But it was a concern. And the other thing is, you never are dressed properly for a cold winter for a walk 200 miles in enemy territory to get home. My father was in the trenches in World War I. And he had a guy named Stacy from Aurelia. And they were dirty in the trenches. He said, if only we could wash our feet. So Stacy said, let's go up to the farmhouse and see if they can give us some water to wash our feet. So he says, Ed, I speak French, so you just shut up. So they went to the farmer's door, knocked on the door. The lady came to the door and said, oui, monsieur. Says, Madame, avez-vous a dish to wash the feet in? That was his French. But anyway, there's an awful lot of fun in wars when they have the entertaining people come through and all the other things. And there are a lot of things that are sort of magic when you're, for example, in a clear moonlit night and you're above the clouds in the Mosquito and in a full moon and just waving around in the clouds. Because it was such a fast airplane, well, the bomber stream had a 50% loss rate. We only had a 30% loss rate, which was a lot better. But our kind of flying, we did it very carefully. They say, don't do nothing dumb. The guys who didn't make it. And usually it's from ground strafing. And I lost my good buddy, Ken Eastwood. I had an accident from son of a gun had been turned on one wheel and it ruined the tire, so I came into land and went bang, and I dragged it off and flew past the tower in the Mosquito. The CO said, George, you got a blown tire on your right side, your starboard tire. He says, if you can bring it in with the gear down, we won't have to change the propeller. That was Sticky Murphy, who was a spy guy. I said, okay, sir, I'll give it a try. So I had an air cadet up for a ride. So I came in and I landed and held it off as long as I could, then chopped the throttles, turned off the switches, and the other wheel came down and just grabbed, flung me around to the right. The left engine came off and took away everything in front of me, broke the leg of the air cadet I'd had up for a ride, and we came to a stop after sliding backwards for a while. And I was on operations the next night. I didn't want to spoil my trip, but it cut my shoe right from the center right out to the skin. But it injured it badly, but I was able to walk on my heel. So, but
One more question for you here, George.
Thanks. I've heard all sorts of stories about low-level night intrusions into Europe.
Yeah.
And I wonder, how do you manage to avoid all the obstacles, and what sort of altitude are you typically flying at?
Well, that's a heck of a good question, because if it's a black night, you can see the difference between land and water always. But it doesn't help with things that stick up. I was low one night, I flew over this fence, this kid fell over backwards. I went over just about to touch the top of a church beside the steeple. But you have to be so aware, because you're going so fast. Sometimes that's a safety factor. But what I did, because I used to get airsick, they couldn't give me aerobatics, but I did everything but. And I was upside down lots of the times and so forth. But I didn't do actual rolls till I got back, and I was shown how to do it. But that helped me. But they did tell me when they finally took me up in the Harvard, said, well, you're all right, but you're no better than a CFS instructor. An instructor's instructor. So that's good enough for me.
You mentioned Grantham.
Yes.
Can you tell me what year? My uncle was stationed there in Lancaster's 100 Squadron.
Okay. That was Spittlegate at Grantham. And I was there just after Guy Gibson and the guys did the dam busting. And I was there when Guy Gibson came in, landed with that Lancaster with a big hole in his belly, to go and see Bomber Harris after the dam bust. And then Guy Gibson was up in a Mosquito as a master of ceremonies in another raid and was killed, unfortunately. But Grantham was a permanent force station, and I heard this awesome music. Dum da 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 da. And this was by Glenn Miller. So I went down to my window, overlooked the mess where the phonograph was. I went through every record, and I found it was Adios by Glenn Miller. So I went out and I bought every Glenn Miller record I could buy, all 78s. And then I left to come home, and I gave them to my sister, came back to Canada, and bought them all again. But Glenn Miller was, for me, a superhero for what he did with music. You know, he was just so, and I Left My Heart at the Stage Door Canteen, and those kinds of songs that were just pump you right up with everything. It's just awesome music, yes.
Thanks, George. I'm afraid you're going to start singing, so I'll ask one more question here.
Yeah, the Mosquito.
Yes.
Being made out of wood.
Oh,
Did
okay.
it give you a marked advantage evading the German radar?
I would say yes, but don't forget we had metal cowlings and metal engines. We had a smaller signature, but also we were pretty low level, and we were not straight and level all the time. I was going over the Zyder Z one time, and every once in a while I'd say to Paul, okay, Paul, look back. And I'd pull back, and he'd look to see if there's anybody on our tail. Going over the Zyder Z one time, we'd go between Meppel and Zwolle. I pulled back. There was a Junkers 88 in formation with me, ready to pull behind me immediately and blow my tail off the way he killed my commanding officer a week or two before that. I thought he had gone to Guttersloh, but he was killed near Zwolle. So we were faster than most of them, but I didn't want to use up my gas for fast. So I used to cruise at 240 miles an hour. So we could have cruised much faster than that, but there's no point. We had to go to an aerodrome or aerodromes and circle it for an hour and let them know we're there, waiting for their night fighters to come home. And the night fighters didn't like us because they'd come home after shooting at our bombers. They'd be low in fuel and have no ammunition. So as an incentive, if they shot us down, it would count double. Well, we didn't like that either. But that's something I always wanted to fly, was an enemy fighter. We had the enemy flight come in and join us at the squadron. The captured German aircraft came in, and I got to walk into a Heinkel 111. And the last time I saw it, I was shooting at it. But it's just that circumstances put me in a lot of interesting positions to satisfy my really enormous interest in that stuff. It didn't make me any smarter, mind you.
Well, we're really amazed that you're here today at 95 years old, standing on your own and sharing these here stories of so long ago and so clearly and vividly. And George, we're honored to have you here.
Oh, thank
George
you.
Stewart, DFC.
Thank you.
Let's stand up a little.
Thank you.